When I first came to China with President Ford in 1974, it was another world of somber, fearful Chinese in the final throes of the cruelties of the Cultural Revolution, a terrible secret they kept from us as we made the exotic tourist stops.
More than 2,000 years ago, Chinese guards stood at the Great Wall, looked out across that barren landscape, and kept watch for, among other things, invading bands of Huns.
8 years later, I was back in China. Mao was dead, and the walls of secrecy were coming down. But it remained a mysterious place with a long march to the modern world.
But you are not suggesting, are you, sir, that you're not about to become the General Secretary?
I do not.
What brings us here, obviously, is Asia and specifically China tonight. And we're really privileged each in our own way. Those of you who are here from China and those of us who are looking on with fascination and a sense of awe, to be witness to one of the exceptional and extraordinary and sweeping transformations in the long history of mankind. When I first went in 1975 with President Ford, it was like going not to a 19th century country, but to an 18th century country. It was simply that primitive. Even in the heart of Beijing, the Hutongs had soft coal for cooking. There were standpipes out where the people would come out in the morning to do their morning toilet. They would, brushing their teeth out of a common place.
Ford were met at the bottom of the ramp by Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, the man now in charge of running China on a day-to-day basis.
This was the first time that we'd really seen Deng in such a prominent position, and he was the dynamic character of his personality is hard to overstate in that world of very constrained personalities.
The press had reported his chain smoking. The president talked about his pipe smoking.
There was actually a meeting the next day that I think I should share with you as well. I don't know whether I've ever told you this, Orville, but we were complaining that we were not getting enough substance out of this meeting. The White House arranged for a meeting between Deng and President Ford, and I was the pool reporter. That is, I represented the rest of my White House colleagues. And I went to the meeting, and it was in a small room, and Deng was sitting at a table with briefcase open, very serious, not exchanging any banter with us at all. And the president walked in, and Deng said to him through the translator, very deliberately, "You had a very important meeting with my chairman last night." And President Ford said, "And Betty went to the ballet, and Susan was out at the wall, and they've had the best time. And I just, the food here is terrific. I'm just having the best time." So I went back up and wrote this report and said, some signal was missed somewhere along the line. Because the president just completely blew by the important meeting with the chairman. And one of Henry Kissinger's aides came to me and said, "We're rescheduling another meeting for tomorrow morning. We want you to be back in that same room again." So I went back the next morning. There was Deng. This time, he is bantering with us, spitting, smoking, talking about his chain smoking, complaining about us covering it too much, but a lot of fun. Ford comes in, very serious, carrying his briefcase. They sit down at the table, and Deng leans across and said, "Mr. President, I hope you had a good night's rest." And the president said, "And I had a very good meeting with your chairman." So it didn't always go very smoothly. And it was also on that trip that President Ford decided why Henry or somebody didn't intervene, but he took his immediate staff back out to Air Force One for a steak dinner one night, and the Chinese were deeply offended, dragged him back into town after the steak dinner and made him eat like a 9-course Chinese meal. But what you saw there was a snapshot, and it comes through so vividly about how dangerous the world was. We were at the height of the Cold War at that point, and Richard Nixon, for all of his considerable flaws, and they were considerable, was brilliant in his opening of China and playing the China card to triangulate the relationship.
China is changing. More than 10 years after the Cultural Revolution and the death of Mao Zedong, the world's most populous country
This was 1987 when we were there, Baifeng, and you were there as well, Orville, for Changing China. We did that whole series of reports.
Chinese officials today confirmed reports of a bloody confrontation between Tibetans and police in Lhasa, the Tibetan capital.
In Tibet,
China said that 6 demonstrators were killed.
And that was part of the 1987 trip, and I had persuaded the Chinese authorities that I should go to Tibet to do a story about tourism, which was not exactly what I had in mind. I was going to Tibet to try to document the human rights abuses that were going on there and the enormous cultural clash. They got very excited about it, so they sent the Panchen Lama, the number 2 Lama, who had stayed behind when the Dalai Lama fled. And Meredith was with me, and we had, I think, maybe one of the most exceptional tours that you could possibly have at that time. We got to go everywhere.
Red Guards tried to eradicate Buddhism in the 60s and 70s. They
We
destroyed
went to,
more than 6,000.
There was a Kampa monk who was living at 17,000 feet way up in the mountains in a cave. They were reconstructing one of the monasteries. There was a Tibetan burial site, so we had to climb up there to get to him. And then they caught on to us because I used Meredith as a diversion, that we were looking for artifacts, and then I took a picture of the Dalai Lama and I walked around the Jokhang Palace. The Chinese insisted that the Dalai Lama had no standing in Tibet, that no one cared about him anymore. So these kind of postcard pictures of him. I walked along and held them up, and the pilgrims fell to absolute prostrate position and kissed the pictures, and the Chinese went berserk at that point. And they realized what we were up to, and they put Meredith under not house arrest, but car arrest. They told her to go sit in the car and not move. And this is the Panchen Lama, by the way, the number 2 guy who stayed behind when the Dalai Lama fled as a teenager across the mountains. He was a very important figure. He got co-opted, obviously, and he died not too long after that. And when I got to Dharamsala to see the Dalai Lama, he was very, very eager to know about this man who'd been his friend for a long time, but he'd been co-opted by the Chinese.
I believe Tibet is part of China, and the Chinese government works for the benefit of the Tibetan people.
This is the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, his first American television appearance. Meredith and I were enthralled by him. He, both in terms of his personality, his spirituality, and his ability to connect to you, just kind of on a one-on-one basis, left a lasting impression on me. Couldn't have been more generous, or, as you can see, more personable. He gave me a wonderful little yak butter teacup, but he gave Meredith a ring. So I've often said that she's a polygamist. She has, she's engaged to the Dalai Lama and married to me.
On Meet the Press, Sunday, September 27th, 1987. And good morning, I'm Chris Wallace. All this week, NBC News is examining the changing China. And today, we get the view from the top.
This is Meet the
Earlier
Press
this week,
with
NBC's
Zhao Zemin,
Tom Brokaw.
who the only time a general secretary of the party had ever appeared on Meet the Press. By then, they'd gone to Western dress, and he drank 2 liters of Qingdao beer while we were doing this. He kept him down to the side. And every time they'd cut to this shot, then he'd take another slug of beer when I was there.
The final question. 2 of your predecessors, Hu Yaobang and Hua Guofeng, who were both the General Secretary of the Communist Party in this country, lost their jobs unceremoniously. Does that make you worry about your own job security?
I haven't given consideration to that. I'm not willing to be.
He expressed sympathy with the goals of the students in Tiananmen Square. He was sacked and put under house arrest.
What was your thought in '87, how the trajectory would come out in terms of openness of the political system?
The metaphor that I used was that the curtain was beginning to rise and people were beginning to express themselves a little more freely. I mean, that's quite remarkable what he did
That's
on
why I'm asking.
Meet the Press. But Tiananmen's changed that. I mean, and then the door closed again very
Demanding
quickly.
more freedom. It was a heady time until the night of June 4th, when the tanks rolled and the army swept across the square, killing demonstrators and their dreams alike. One image will always linger, a brave young man against the tanks. But his victory was fleeting. The rulers ruled and cracked down hard. With my cameraman, I took a chance and rode a flying pigeon bike into Tiananmen Square to secretly record the changes.
Just 10 days ago, this square was jammed with people
I'll tell you how
democracy.
the bicycle trip,
Now,
that was the first, it was the first footage that anyone got out of Tiananmen Square after the crackdown and the massacre. I had a wonderful cameraman, a beloved comrade of mine from South Africa. We'd been through a hell of a lot together, wars and other things, and he was just a very inventive, adventurous guy. And he was looking it over, and he brought in a new little Sony Hi8 camera. And he said, "Mate, we can do something with this." So he went back upstairs and he got a soft drink box and put it on the back of the bike.
Are you nervous these days?
And we did that for 2 days before they caught on. Now, what you didn't see, which was fairly hilarious, is the second day we now are getting pretty ambitious with what we want to do. We don't want just a shot of Tony taking me riding ahead of me. We go Steven Spielberg. We want to get a really wide shot from a passing car. So we had a driver that we'd arranged for in Beijing, and we put a cameraman in the back of this car down on the floor, and the driver, I could tell, was now beginning to be very wary and a little anxious about what was going on. And as I rode it past Mao in the Forbidden City, my cameraman in the car, they pull up beside me, and he gets up to get a wide shot of me going by. The cameraman, the driver of the limousine realizes that he could be probably summarily executed for this. So he slams down the accelerator and goes about 80 miles an hour. I foolishly try to keep up with the car. While we were there during that time, there was not much interaction. We'd have to slip out and do the interviews as I described with the professor. And I just didn't know where China was going to go from there. They were at an enormously important intersection in their lives. They would have to make a choice about how they were going to control the country, but at the same time they had to keep expanding economically for all the obvious reasons. And so what I think that they did to a large degree was buy off the country. They gave it economic opportunity and prosperity, and people were able to have economic, if not political, freedom. And the apotheosis of that came when we went over for the Olympics. I never had imagined that you could see something like that, a city of that size, so completely transformed and so modern in every conceivable way. The transportation, the power, the landscaping.
I can't help but wonder what Mao would think if he were alive today to see this scene. On the other hand, if he were alive today, it's unlikely that China would be hosting the Olympic Games, a modern and prosperous industrial state, even though it still has a lot of the Mao hangover in terms of political control.